The eerie silence of the dead mixed with the cries of the dying as Cantor made his way from the Chapel of Ease toward a stone staircase that ran up the walls of the town. He had indulged himself in the chapel, as he was prone to do. As much as he hungered for gold and for acclaim, he felt the need to inflict suffering on the brothers of the Blackened Crown like a man dying of thirst needed water. As he mounted the steps toward the wall, a never-ending trickle of molten gold running back and forth across his own flesh, he could hear the clicking and clacking of the monk coming behind him. Trapped in a cage of living gold, he had no choice but to follow, and his involuntary whimpers brought a smile to Cantor's face, hidden by his mask, but there nonetheless. The monk was strong, as some of them were, but strength only allowed him to endure what was happening to him, not to change it. As he reached the top of the wall, Cantor just had time to witness one of the ships of his fleet seem to splinter just above the waterline, halfway down the cargo hold. The stricken ship rapidly took on water, swiftly sinking beneath the waves as those on board dived from the deck into the sea. Some were festooned in too much gold, their gaudy showings an attempt to appeal to their master, and they were dragged below the waves. Cantor would make sure that the treasures they took with them were all recovered before they left. Someone had been careless, it seemed, too slow to remove the beast Walpurgis from his place in the hold, and now the ship was sinking. Walpurgis was fine at sea, effectively catatonic, wrapped in a prison of his own grief, but the crew of his prison ship knew they were close to land when the creature grew restless. Walpurgis was a slave of Mammon, another lost soul, drowned in the river of greed, but if there was a demon prince of grief somewhere in hell's annals, perhaps the war pig would have bowed to him instead. Cantor continued his walk through the ruin of Beeritz, with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who was watching things unfold largely as he predicted they would. His crimson robes trailed through the blood and ash that had settled like a dark snowfall across the cobblestones. For his troops' sake, he hoped that nothing of value was burning, or the price for its loss would be steep and painful. It was always interesting to him how quickly towns fell. His troops had made landfall little more than half an hour past, and already the worst of the fighting was over. Of course, that was almost certainly due to Walpurgis, just as the flames and ashes that nibbled at the town were likely due to him as well. The place had been handsome once, but Cantor could never remember it that way, as any value and prestige had only come to this place long after he had fled it, centuries ago. He gazed at the might of the basilica and laughed quietly to himself. Men had dedicated their whole lives to working stone and wood well enough to build this edifice to praise their tyrant god, and he had taken it from them in an instant. They didn't realize the land here was always cursed. They had built their own ruin in the shadow of his, unaware that he would always return, always seek to eradicate this place from both memory and the map. Cantor had heard once, before his fall, that the land had memory, that the stones and the trees held echoes of words and deeds. Now he had returned here to turn the stones to glass. Now the trees were burning. He paused at the edge of the square and looked across it, and felt the same quiet satisfaction he always felt at the sight of successful work. Although this, he thought, turning his masked face slowly to take in the full breath of the carnage, this was rather less orderly than he preferred. Walpurgis had been through here. He knew the signs. Any of them who had served long enough in Hell's crusading host knew the signs of Walpurgis. Every military action left evidence of the weapons deployed, even the ones sourced from Mammon's deepest vaults. An ordinary force would leave bodies, artillery would leave craters, splintered wood and collapsed walls. Walpurgis left so little flesh that you wondered if anyone had been there to fight him, but the ruin he left was total. The flagstones of the square had been cracked and heaved upward in great jagged slabs, as though the earth itself had recoiled from the weight of what had crashed down into it. A fountain at the centre, carved from pale limestone and depicting some local saint with hands outstretched in a gesture of welcome, had been reduced to rubble, and the pieces of it were scattered across the square in a rough circle. The saint's outstretched hands lay several feet from the rest of the wreckage, the fingers still joined in that gentle, imploring gesture, now pointing at nothing, and receiving no intervention from the god they once beseeched. The ground was splashed with blood, so much of it, but beyond some disturbing lumps of half-chewed flesh and bone, there was little sign of the people who had attempted to defend this section of the town. Cantor walked toward them and looked down at the severed hands for a long moment. They were roughly hewn and poorly made by the untalented hands of some apprentice. Perhaps their destruction had been a mercy. The buildings around the square had fared no better. Several had been opened like rotten fruit, their facades caved inwards as though struck by something enormous and uncaring. One wall had been breached in a shape that Cantor recognized with the jaded familiarity of long experience, the rough and rounded silhouette of a shoulder. He reached up in his free hand and traced the edge of the impact, feeling the cracked and powdered stone crumble beneath his fingers. Inside, through the ruined wall, he could see what had once been a tavern. The furniture had been reduced to kindling, and the barrels behind the serving counter had been staved in, their contents pooling across the floors in rivers of dark wine and pale ale that ran together and trickled in thin streams through the broken wall, washing gently around his feet. The walls and ceiling were smeared with blood, and anyone who tried to find shelter here had found themselves passed through Walpurgis's crushing teeth, even as their own useless prayers had passed through theirs. Cantor had heard men of science speak of predators, the efficiency of the hunt, and the clean economies of nature. Walpurgis was none of these things. There was nothing clean or economical about what he did. He ate as he did everything else, with catastrophic excess, and with what Cantor had come over centuries to understand was not hunger, precisely, but a desperate and doomed attempt to fill a cavity that no amount of blood or flesh could ever touch. Walpurgis's hunger, his insatiable greed for flesh, had been a gift from Mammon, and it would bind him forever in service to the Lord of Want. He had committed a terrible act once, long ago, tempted over a precipice that would have driven any man insane. Someone had been loved, and that someone had been lost, and in the gulf between those two facts, something monstrous had been born, and now would forever act as a stain upon creation. The grief of this fact had nowhere to go, and so it went everywhere, constantly, in all directions at once. A violence with neither direction nor intention. A tide that rose and did not know how to stop. Only at sea was Walpurgis calm, the gentle waves sending him back to happier years. The one memory that Mammon had allowed him to keep, the fuel to the fire that was the might of the war pig's greed and rage and anguish. The simple rocking of a crib. Cantor came to the far side of the square and turned down a narrow street that descended towards the harbour, and the devastation continued without interruption. Every door had been torn from its hinges, not with the deliberate purpose of soldiers conducting a search, but with the careless ease of something too large and too strong to bother with the concept of doors at all. Shutters had been ripped from windows. A horse lay on its side in the middle of the road, almost startling due to the fact that it had not been eaten, though Walpurgis had no care for horseflesh. Cantor stepped around it without breaking stride. The street opened suddenly onto a small square, and here Cantor stopped walking. Walpurgis stood at the center of it, nearly 12 feet of him, densely muscled but standing like the weight of merely existing sought to drive him through the cobbles of the square. In the early morning light, he was a terrible and dreadful thing to behold. The great barrel of his torso was wrapped in plate armor, and the porcine features of his face were hidden away behind his war helm, shaped to mimic two tusks of a great boar protruding jaggedly from the mask, the serrated edges designed to cut, rip and tear through flesh and wood and stone alike. The creature, like the rest of Cantor's fleet, wore trinkets and medallions of gold, enough to make a man rich for a lifetime, but he knew the beast cared not for those, as his greed was a punishment, not an expression of self. His greed was a seed, planted in love, and it had blossomed into tragedy. Walpurgis was standing perfectly still, and as Cantor drew level with him, he could see what had brought the beast to a halt. The path of destruction had brought him to this square, which gazed out to the north, and before them, glistening like gold and jewels upon silken sheets, was the sea. With no flesh to eat, and the sparkling seas as a distraction, Walpurgis had been left alone again with his sadness, and had willingly sunk into it, even though the memories he latched onto burned him like acid and fire. Cantor turned toward him with an unhurried pace, his robes whispering through the debris, the soft dripping of the molten gold against the cobbles, and even the slow ticking of the caged monk coming to a halt. The masked face turned upward to regard Walpurgis, who was a full head and more above him, even at Cantor's considerable height. "You've been busy," Cantor said, and Walpurgis did not reply, and just stood there motionless and mute. "The harbour is secured," Cantor continued. "The fleet destroyed. The town is taken. There is no further work to do here." He paused. "That means that you can return to the beach." The great head turned slowly, and the burning eyes found the masked face that Cantor held aloft, and for a moment there was something in those eyes beyond the grief and rage, something that might, in another creature, in another life, have been the beginning of a question. "There is nothing left to eat," Cantor told him. Walpurgis was difficult to predict. Despite his current calm, he could turn to fury in an instant. He had never shown either the consideration or the intent to see how Cantor's molten gold affected his taste, but from time to time it occurred to the creature that Walpurgis might be willing to try. Something moved across the vast face, too complex and too far from human to be easily named. The jaw worked, the tusks caught the morning light, and then, like a tide that had reached its limits and begins almost imperceptibly to pull back, the terrible stillness shifted. He turned and walked away, back to the beach, where he would wait until some troops led him to a new ship, where he would once again sleep, seeking poor comfort among nightmares that he thought of as dreams. Hey all, thanks so much for listening to the second story in this series, I guess, about the Creature Crusade collaboration that I'm doing with Creature Caster. This one was about Walpurgis, the war pig, and I hope you find the model to be as interesting and exciting as I do. We wanted to create something huge and powerful and fierce that looked like it could just tear through whatever World War kind of setting you wish to use it in. This one is going out a little late this month. I believe the files will drop tomorrow, because we had little bits of delays because of things like Adepticon, and I've been just so sick. Just horrendously, horribly sick for the last few weeks. Doing absolutely anything has been a tremendous struggle, to be honest. So thank you so much for taking the time to check out the video. Thank you so much if you've signed up to the Creature Crusade. I really appreciate it. And if you want to get your hands on this mini, just follow the link in the description below over to Creature Crusade and sign up, and it will be there for you very soon. So thank you so much for watching, folks. I hope you had a wonderful Easter, and all the best.